All right, so we're divers. I presume most of you are divers or snorkelers, and Australia's got some magnificent scuba diving, coral reef, and temperate waters. We've got a great variety, and we've got a huge amount of snorkeling up in right around the country, but particularly tropical snorkeling in the Great Barrier Reef and the north of Western Australia. So there's a lot of people doing it, and it's a bit of a contention about how many there are, but probably about 90,000 scuba divers, and it's unknown how many snorkelers, possibly a couple of 100,000 non-Australian national snorkeling plus tourists. But diving has some risks, as you can see. So we need to be aware of those risks, and they include environmental risks. So it can be the sea conditions, the water conditions. It can be things in the environment, sea creatures occasionally. Health is a big factor, physical health, medical, psychological health. Training and experience are important factors that affect your risk. Equipment failure, unfamiliarity or misuse of equipment, which is coming up a little bit more with some of the technical equipment, rebreathers. Poor decision making, attitude. So they sort of pretty much cover the risks. And we get accidents resulting from human error, natural disease, environmental hazards, problems with equipment, and quite often it's a combination of these. And I've got a database going back to 1965 of Australian diving related fatalities. And in that database, there are 450, between 65 and 2021, there's 456 scuba, which include 15 rebreather deaths. There's 88 surface supply breathing apparatus deaths and 464 snorkel deaths. So quite interesting to note the similar number of scuba and snorkel deaths over that period within that 1,000 odd deaths. And if we look at the trends over time, you'll see that the scuba was, it's not rising dramatically. There's peaks and troughs throughout, but there is actually a slight rise and then it flattens off again up here. And the snorkels lifted quite high. This is in the early 90s when the Great Barrier Reef became very, very sexy, and a lot of people international tourists started going to the reef, and that's where a lot of the snorkel fatalities occur. If we look at the ages of scuba diving victims in Australia from 65 to 2018, you can see there's been a steady rise in the ages, and the rise is about 4.6, nearly 5 years per decade. So divers are getting older. And that's me when I started diving, young, handsome, virile, and that's unfortunately more like me now. And this is fairly typical. You're getting younger divers aging and you're getting older divers coming to the field because they can. If we look at the 20 years from 2000 to 2019, this looks at the annual deaths for scuba in red and snorkel, and you can see they're up and down, peaks and troughs. If you combine it, there's about 25 deaths per year, about 9 on average for scuba and about 15 on average for snorkel. So we had peaks and troughs. This was a big year of snorkeling, and a lot of them happened in Queensland, a lot of them over a couple of weeks. So if we look at the scuba deaths during that period, there are 185, that's 9 per annum, and 9 of those were using rebreathers. 3/4 of the victims were males, and the median age was 46, so middle-aged males. The youngest was 17 and the oldest was 72. And of interest, 38% of the victims were overweight and 42% obese. And if you look at Australian national data, 67 of Australian adults are overweight or obese, 67%. And here we've got 80%. And 31% are obese in the Australian population. We've got 42%. This is an older cohort. And, you know, in this age range, there's probably about 37% of Australians that are obese. But the diving victims are higher than that. If we look at the location where the scuba deaths have happened in the period, in the 20 years, most of them, just over a quarter, occurred in New South Wales, just under a quarter in Queensland, And then we've got Victoria, Western Australia, and so on. So we're getting the bulk, more than half in New South Wales and Queensland. This is a lot of tourists, and this is more locals. In 55% overall of the scuba deaths were in a private setting, people diving from the shore themselves with their friends or from the private boat, and 45% were in a commercial setting. When I look at scuba deaths, which I do quite a lot, it's you've probably all heard of the domino effect. One thing leads to another, leads to another. And we look at it in terms of a chain of events. So analyze diving deaths as a chain of events analysis. And for example, look at a diver who's got a faulty pressure gauge. And because it's faulty, it's reading high, they run out of air. They make an emergency ascent to the surface, often not with enough exhalation, and suffer an arterial gas embolism as a result, which Simon's described. They become unconscious in the water, and then because they're in the water unconscious, they drown. So if we look at the chain of events, the first factor we look at is predisposing factors, and something that the person went into that dive with that was stacked against them. And in this case, they had a faulty gauge, faulty equipment. The trigger to this accident was gas supply related. They ran out of air because of the faulty gauge. The disabling agent is something that happens to them or they do that then causes the next stage, them going unconscious. And that is an ascent related, a rapid ascent with inadequate exhalation. The disabling condition is a condition that made them go unconscious, and often in the water, it precedes drowning. And that in this case was a cage, a cerebral arterial gas embolism. And the cause of death that the pathologist would write up is drowning. And when we look at the diving fatalities, often it's drowning. And it's not just diving, any in-water fatalities, it's often drowning. And the early diving reports used to say 70-odd% were drowning. But it's important to go back a stage and say, why did that person drown? Was drowning the primary event, or did they drown because they went unconscious for another reason? And that's why it's important to look at the step before the disabling condition. As far as predisposing factors, there's a variety of them. They can be health related. They could be poor planning. It can be poor communication or coordination within a dive group between buddies. It can be an absence of appropriate equipment or faulty equipment, like in the example. Organisational problems, it might be procedures within a diving operation. Training and experience related, unsafe supervision, or some diving activities, for example, extreme deep diving and overhead diving carry a greater risk. So that would be activity related. If we look at 290, well, of 180 of the deaths of these 185 series, I identified about 294 possible predisposing factors that the person went into the dive with that influenced the outcome. And half of those were health related, and the majority of the health related factors were cardiac factors. And often these people had what we call occult health conditions. They weren't aware of them. They weren't being treated. They didn't know that they had cardiac disease, and that's a bit of a worry. About a third of the predisposing factors were inexperienced. They were too inexperienced for what they did. There were planning inadequacies in quite a few, and about a third again, and then equipment problems. One thing it's important to realise, especially when one gets older, is diving is arrhythmogenic. It means it triggers cardiac problems. So somebody that might have be borderline cardiac disease or borderline potential for cardiac arrhythmia can be tipped into it quite easily by diving. And that's starting off by immersion per se. As soon as you get in the water, gravity's gone. And with the loss of gravity, you get blood redistributing from your limbs from your into your chest, into your thorax, and your heart has to pump against that blood to expand and to do its job, and that creates stress on the heart. Exertion, obviously, in the water, anxiety, getting cold shuts down your peripheral blood vessels and directs more blood to the chest area around the heart. Aspiration, breathing in salt water, which we often do, can trigger off arrhythmias. Increased breathing resistance from the equipment and increased gas density as we go deeper on scuba, and increased oxygen partial pressure as we go deeper on scuba are all factors that can trigger arrhythmias. So it's a witch's brew there. If we look at the disabling conditions in scuba, 37% of these of this batch, 185, were primary aspiration of water. So they would be your classic primary drownings. At least a quarter of them were cardiac related. The person often, they might have had a heart attack. More often they had an arrhythmia and went unconscious. Gas embolism was 12%, immersion pulmonary edema about 3%, and trauma, which was mainly sharks, a couple of boats, a couple of crocodiles, were the rest. So if we're looking at the compressed gas diver deaths from 2000 to 2019, 57% of the divers were 45 years or older. And at least 80% of this group had suffered cardiac-related disabling condition. So we'll talk about that later on. With the snorkels, there were nearly 300 deaths, about 15 per annum, and about 2/3 of them were what we call mainly surface snorkelers. They hang around on the surface blowing gas out in and out of their snorkel. They're not really duck diving. They're not really breath hold divers. There were about 1/3 that were breath hold divers. The age overall, the median age was 50, with a range of 15 to 85. But there were two groups. The surface snorkelers had a median age of 57 years, compared to the breath hold divers, were a younger, generally fitter group, unsurprisingly, had an age of 35 years old. 88% were males, and 46% were overseas tourists overall throughout Australia. But 83% of the victims in Queensland were overseas tourists. In the setting, 34%, about 1/3 were in a commercial setting. But in Queensland, almost all, I think about 98% of the fatalities, the snorkel victims, were in a commercial setting. That is, with a commercial operator. 7 of the victims overall were practicing breath hold diving in pools. We look at where the snorkel deaths occurred. 56% occurred in Queensland, no surprise, because they get so many more snorkelers, often international tourists, then Western Australia, New South Wales, and so on. If we look at what activity they were doing, about 2/3 were sightseeing, 18% was spearing, and 10% was seafood harvesting. And people think that the sharks are the most dangerous marine creature. In fact, these are far more dangerous, the lobster and the abalone. 30 of the breath hold divers drowned following a breath holding blackout. They held their breath too long, ran out of sufficient oxygen to maintain consciousness, and subsequently blacked out and drowned. 7 of these were in pools, and 5 with others nearby, like very close by. One had somebody playing about a metre from them. Others had people on the side of the pool. So they weren't watching closely enough. The buddy situation, about just under 1/3 set out solo, and then there would have been more that go out in a group, and they're essentially solo in a group because no one's allocated to particularly look after them. Only about a quarter were with the buddy at the time of their incident. So the buddy system is something that's given lip service in the diving industry, and it's something that really needs to be emphasised because if it hits the fan, you want somebody there close by to help. Looking at the predisposing factors with the snorkelling victims, pre-existing health factors were implicated in just under half, in 47%, and these were mainly cardiac, often clogged up coronary arteries that they may not have known about. Other predisposing factors were planning issues, for instance, going out solo, going out in obviously adverse conditions that they didn't have the ability to deal with. Poor skills and inexperience were identified in at least a quarter of the cases, and about 14% were doing what's called higher risk activities, which were breath hold extension usually, or spearfishing in areas where you know there's likely to be large sharks. The disabling conditions with the snorkelers included primary drowning, so that accounted for about 43%, cardiac events in just over a third, trauma in 6%, and immersion pulmonary edema, we think about 4 cases. So human factors play a big part in diving accidents. So, and risk awareness and management are essential. So it's important that the participants are aware of the potential risks and are, prepared to take those risks. Prevention is the key to it, and diving medical assessment for those with chronic conditions and all aged 45 years or older is recommended. Maintain fitness and a healthy weight. Make sure you've got good training, common sense, choose equipment well and be familiar with it and maintain it, and have a good buddy system. Thank you.